The second a game is released to store shelves, it's immediately put on a timer from then to when it inevitably dies. It is a sad but given truth that a game's importance and value will falter until it is reduced to nothing, leaving it to become the topic of today's video, irrelevant. Irrelevancy is a game's worst nightmare. If there's no one to play the game for one reason or another, the game is essentially left to simply exist in this existential purgatory, never to be played or thought after that. A game can become irrelevant for several reasons: being replaced, being a failure, or just not being substantial enough to warrant consistent interest. So in today's video, why don't we take a look at examples of each, as well as compare them to examples of relevant games and how they've managed to remain that way. Being replaced is no fun, just ask my older brother. Games have been getting replaced since their inception. The first game ever made, Tennis for Two, was ultimately replaced by Pong. Miss Pac-Man followed up Pac-Man, but these aren't good examples I want to focus on. Pong and Pac-Man are some of the most iconic video games ever made, so to call these irrelevant would just be incorrect. No, the examples I want to look at are yearly released games like FIFA, 2K, Madden, pretty much any game revolving around a sport. Sports are something that are constantly evolving, new players debuting, older players leaving, drafts changing the lineup of teams, players getting better or worse, so it makes sense as to why these series would need to be updated with a new game each year. What that means, however, is that each game is really only given that 1 year to simmer until it's replaced by the next annual installment. This no doubt can, and more often than not has, become a repetitive practice, with the only real updates being roster changes. The want to pick up the next game dwindles more and more with each installment. I'd bet good money that a substantial amount of consumers that are buying each game are doing so just so they can have the most recent title, making each game that came before the newest one all the more irrelevant. The most obvious comparison to these titles would just be any series not released annually. Take Forza Horizon, for example. These games are released biannually, giving them a bit more time to cook in the gaming market. These games are also given constant updates, ranging from new cars to completely new maps. These substantial updates, along with each base game in the series taking place in a different location, gives players more of a reason to go back to each installment, more than just a simple nostalgia trip. No doubt one of the main reasons someone would play a sports game that came out years ago. Being a failure is no fun, just ask me. There's really only two ways for a game to fail: critically or financially. Critically, of course, being when the game is deemed bad by a majority of the consumers to play it. Take Sonic Boom, for example. While the franchise as a whole is relevant, of course it is, this game certainly isn't, or at the very least is getting to that point. It's boring, it's tedious, it looks horrible, it's not finished. When it first came out, you couldn't go 5 seconds without seeing someone trash this game on the internet, but you can only talk ill of something for so long before there's just nothing else you can say about it. Funnily enough, however, if a game fails so hard to the point it's deemed one of the worst games of all time, it rebounds to being relevant again. Sticking with Sonic for this example, Sonic 06. Pretty much everything I said about Boom applies to 06, multiplied by 100, sprinkled with a jumbled, incoherent story, and then you throw bestiality, necrophilia in there for good measure. Never, ever in a million years should this game be considered anything over bad, but because of how good it is at being the worst, it will never lose that point of relevancy, unlike Boom, which will always be overlooked when it comes to the worst Sonic games. Financially is debatably a more interesting way for a game to fail and become irrelevant. It's one thing for a game to be so bad no one cares enough to talk about it, it's another thing to just have no one play it. There's plenty of games that are considered to be awful that have sold well: Wii Music, Infinite Warfare, The Kinect, which isn't a game, I know, but games that are considered to be good that have sold horribly are far more interesting. A prime example of this is Chibi Robo for the GameCube. I haven't played it myself, but I've heard nothing but praise from people who have played it. The concept of being a tiny robot having to tackle these everyday obstacles that takes us seconds to do, but hours for Chibi Robo, is a cool idea, and I've heard it was executed well. It's just that barely anyone bought it. 130,000 units sold on a console that sold 22 million units, which in itself is also a low number compared to the other consoles that were selling at that time. Because of this, Chibi Robo just isn't relevant, despite having good scores from both users and critics. While this next example doesn't really apply nowadays, it definitely did when it first came out. Earthbound, selling 440,000 units on a console that sold more than double what the GameCube did at 49.1 million. It was mainly due to a lack of advertising, and bad advertising at that, with ads exclaiming, "Earthbound stinks." Like, how is that supposed to help move copies? Even with it being a joke, I still know nothing of the game other than its apparent smell. But with Ness and Lucas in Smash, a re-release on the Wii U Virtual Console, and a die-hard fanbase, this game is now widely recognized as one of the best RPGs ever, despite its irrelevancy when it first came out. And our final example of how a game can be irrelevant is a lack of interest. If people stop caring about your game, no matter how well it's sold or how good people say it is, none of that matters if they don't play it anymore. I believe a great example of this is Pokken Tournament DX. It sold well, 1.3 million units is nothing to sneeze at. It's a competent fighter with an interesting dynamic, having both 2D and 3D fights with the phase shift mechanic, but no one talks about it or really pays it any attention. It's a fighting game on the same platform as Smash Bros. Of course it's not going to be the talk of the town. Out of all of these examples, I'd have to say irrelevancy due to a lack of interest is the worst fate a game could suffer. To see a game like ARMS start off as this hot new IP with a cool idea slowly become less and less prevalent in gaming is definitely a sour sight. It had potential, but it just wasn't meant to be. At least with the other examples, there is some benefit. If a game is irrelevant because it's bad, good. Game sucks, shouldn't be talked about. And with Chibi Robo being so obscure, it becomes a hidden gem, something a person would take pride in being one of the few people to play it. But with a lack of interest, there are tons of people who have played the game who don't now because they don't care anymore. To end this video on a high note, I would like to ask a favor to all who made it this far. If you have the time, the money, go out and find a game you wouldn't have played otherwise, a game that for whatever reason isn't talked about anymore, and then play it. Play it for a minute, a few hours, maybe a few days, and after that, tell someone about it, and ask them to do the same, because gaming can be an adventure, but it's up to you when to start it, where, and with who. And I don't know about you, but I'd want my adventure to be nothing anyone else has ever done before. So with that all said, I'm easily easy, and I'll see you next time.